Alright, hey guys, tonight we're going to be talking about evidence for evolution. Now, it's not like we need any more evidence to convince people of evolution. However, there are a lot of different pieces that we can put together to formulate good results about how organisms are evolutionarily related to one another. So we're going to go through several different types of evidence for evolution, evidence of evolution tonight, and follow along in your notes. Okay, so our 5 different types that we're going to be reviewing tonight are our fossil record, comparative anatomy, comparative embryology, comparative biochemistry, and geographical distribution. And if any of these words sound crazy, do not worry, we're going to go over them. So first is our fossil record. Now, fossil record is potentially one of the most important sources of information for evolution that we have. We've found a lot of fossils over the years, and we've put them together in what we call the fossil record. Now, a fossil is just remains of an organism, or is that activity. So it could be actual bones, or it could be more of an impression in any sort of stone or rock that's taken place over millions of years, hundreds of thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, and we have now just discovered it, and we can put it together and make inferences about what that organism was like, how it lived, or potentially what ancestors it has, or if it's potentially the ancestor of a living organism today. So we learned a lot about the dinosaurs through our fossil record. And there was actually a very interesting case of a new human species that was discovered, we think, this past summer, called Homo naledi. This is, again, a homonym, so it's in the same genus as us, Homo sapiens. And there's some scientific debate, because it was so recent, it was so quickly published, about this particular organism and whether or not it actually is its own species. Some people think it could just be a different version or a different type of Homo erectus, which is another human-related species. Some people think that potentially the researchers did not do a good job in making this conclusion, but there's a lot of thought and effort that goes into it. And so what this particular researcher did is he actually published all his results and the blueprints for the particular remains that he found, so that anyone can 3D print them in their own lab and then observe them and make their own inferences and deductions. Pretty cool. So science is about sharing, critiquing others, and that's exactly what we're doing in this particular case. Another interesting piece of the fossil record, we can make deductions about evolutionary pathways. So for example, Archaeopteryx is a good organism to make the inference that birds came from dinosaurs, because it is more of a dinosaur-esque species, but it's the first one we're going to see with actual feathers. We don't know if the Archaeopteryx itself could actually fly. We think potentially the wings were there for display, but it could have been up and moving off the ground. They're very large and bulky wings as well. Let's talk about comparative anatomy. Now, these are structures that we depended on heavily for a long time before we had our embryonic evidence and our biochemical evidence, especially before we knew exactly how to analyze DNA of different species, which is a very strong piece of evidence. But our comparative anatomy is very helpful because we can look at bones of different structures of different organisms and look at similarities across the board. So we have what we call homologous structures. Now, these are similar structures in different species that may be very different and may be used for completely different purposes. But we actually have the same bone patterns, numbers, and structures for different species across the board. In this image, we have a human, cat, bat, porpoise, and horse. And some of these bones have fused or merged. Some of them have become shorter. But the exact positioning of them, even though the shape is different, it's pretty much the same. So we can deduce that all of these organisms had a common ancestor, and potentially that ancestor then diverged into all these different species later on. We also have what we call analogous structures. Now, analogous is different from homologous. Remember, homo means same. Analogous is similar as well, however, they are different structures specialized for similar functions. Here we have analogous structures, totally different bone setup, totally different materials for wings, but all of these particular structures are made for flight. Now we can see here flight evolved 4 separate times in 4 different types and branches of organisms. We have our insects, we have our dinosaurs, our flying pterodactyl kind of things, we have birds, and then of course we have our flying mammals such as our bats. And there's arguably other events where organisms have been able to develop flight or evolve to show flight, but all of these again are analogous structures, meaning they are different, however they serve the same function. Comparing that back to homologous structures, same structure, different function. Alright, so we're going to move forward. There's another view of our analogous structures if you guys want to take a peek. And also we want to talk about vestigial structures. This sounds like a weird word, but vestigial just means something that is maybe once had a function but no longer has a use. So we see lots of vestigial structures in lots of organisms, and we can make further evolutionary deductions from these vestigial structures. For example, in whales we see the remnants of a pelvic bone. Now it's very small, it's not useful, it's not used for anything now, but we can deduce that once an ancestor of whales had a pelvis and it was, able to walk or be terrestrial, be on land. So that's an interesting theory that a lot of scientists subscribe to. We also have lots of vestigial structures in us. Scientists think the appendix is a vestigial structure, meaning that once it had a purpose, we no longer have or know the purpose of it, and therefore we no longer need it. Comparative embryology. So this is an interesting and newer branch of evolutionary study where we can look at the embryo resemblances of different organisms. And we can see with vertebrates, we have a lot of similarities. All vertebrates are going to show up with a tail, what we call pharyngeal gill slits, when they are in embryonic development. Now, of course, when we are actually born. Humans and birds and fish and reptiles all look very, very different, but as we are developing in the embryo, there's extreme similarities, and it's almost indistinguishable at times. Of course, scientists who study these things can see the differences themselves, but we can look at these embryonic resemblances and see evolutionary patterns as well. Very cool. Okay, most strong piece of evidence that we have nowadays we can use is our comparative biochemistry, where we look at the sequence of amino acids. So again, we haven't studied our biochem yet. We haven't talked about DNA and how they code for proteins, which are built from amino acids. But if we look at similarities of different organisms, we can see sequences of DNA are going to code for the exact same or sequence of amino acids, which are little building blocks of proteins. And this particular gene over here is highlighted where this pretty much the same or very similar amino acid sequence is bolded down here in all these different organisms. So we have a human, rat, mouse, E. coli, bacteria, and some other bacteria as well, pneumonia and P. vulgaris. So all of these are going to be very, very different organisms, but we see that there are similarities within that DNA, within that amino acid sequence. Okay, finally, this is what Darwin used in his very first, theories of natural selection, geographic distribution. Now, geographic distribution, again, it's less based on hard evidence and more on theorizing and making inferences, but it was very important. We look at where certain animals have traveled or migrated or have been separated or isolated, and we can make inferences based on the structures and their habits and how they feed about their evolutionary patterns. Alright, so that is it for this video. Hope you guys enjoyed looking at the different types of evidence of evolution, and we're going to explore them further in class. So make sure you got your basic notes, and we'll see you later.